I went no contact with my parents 7 years ago after they skipped my college graduation to buy my golden child sister a wedding dress. They told our entire extended family I was unstable and mocked my husband as a broke downgrade. I walked away and built a spectacular life without them. Then my father called his attorney demanding my signature on a single legal document. The lawyer slid a $10,000 check across his mahogany desk and told me to sign away my rights to my grandfather and his estate because my family was doing me a huge favor. When I read the name of the company on that deed, I laughed so hard the lawyer dropped his gold pen. What he and my family did not know was that I was the exact person auditing that shell company for federal wire fraud. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and treated you like the scapegoat. You will definitely want to hear how I turned this little meeting into the worst day of their lives. Walking into Attorney Caldwell and his office felt like stepping into a shrine of old money and misplaced arrogance. The room smelled of expensive leather and stale cigars. Caldwell sat behind a massive desk, looking like a man who was very used to intimidating people into submission. I took a seat in the oversized guest chair, smoothing out my tailored suit skirt. I am Zola, 32 years old and a senior forensic accountant, but Caldwell only saw the rebellious daughter my parents had painted me out to be. He did not even offer me a glass of water. He just steepled his fingers and looked down his nose at me with a condescending smirk. Caldwell cleared his throat and announced that my parents, Winston and Brenda, were extremely generous people who wanted to handle this unfortunate family matter quietly. He slid a crisp check across the polished wood right toward my hands. $10,000. Right next to it, he placed a thick legal document with a red sticky note pointing to a signature line. It was a quitclaim deed. Caldwell told me this was my chance to make things right after abandoning my family for 7 long years. He said my parents knew I struggled with stability, and they figured I could use the money since I married Malik, who they still openly referred to as that broke public school teacher. I stared at the check and felt a cold wave of clarity wash over me. $10,000. I looked back up at Caldwell and kept my voice perfectly level. I asked him if this $10,000 was supposed to replace the $50,000 college fund my parents drained during my senior year. I watched his smug expression falter as I reminded him that they took every penny of my tuition money to pay for my sister Brianna to have a lavish country club wedding with her white real estate broker husband Spencer. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. He adjusted his silk tie and said that was ancient family history, and he was only here to facilitate a mutually beneficial transaction. He leaned forward and tapped the quitclaim deed with his manicured index finger. He told me the heritage land in the Sweet Auburn district, left by my grandfather, was sitting useless and draining family resources. According to Caldwell, my brother-in-law Spencer was a brilliant developer who was going to save the property from ruin. Caldwell explicitly used the word unstable again. He said my mother, Brenda, had expressed deep concern about my mental health and thought a quick cash payout would prevent me from having one of my dramatic episodes. He pushed a pen toward me and told me to be a good daughter for once and sign the paper. I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up the thick stack of papers and began reading the fine print with the speed and precision of someone who uncovers financial crimes for a living. I ignored Caldwell, huffing in annoyance as I flipped through the pages. My eyes scanned past the legal jargon and landed squarely on the name of the purchasing entity. It was an LLC registered in Delaware. I read the name of the company once. I read it twice. Then a deep, genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest and echoed loudly through the silent office. I laughed so hard I had to wipe a tear from my eye. Caldwell looked absolutely horrified. He dropped his pen and demanded to know what was so funny about a standard real estate transfer. I tossed the document back onto his desk and pushed the $10,000 check away. I told Caldwell I would not be signing anything today. I told him if my parents and my precious brother-in-law wanted my signature on this specific piece of paper, they would have to ask me for it themselves. I demanded he set up a dinner with the entire family by this weekend. Caldwell sputtered and tried to threaten me, saying my father would drag me to court and strip my rights away. I just smiled, grabbed my designer purse, and walked out the door, knowing exactly how I was going to destroy their entire empire. As the heavy oak door of the law firm clicked shut behind me, my heels echoed against the marble floor of the hallway. I could still hear Caldwell and his pompous voice bouncing around in my mind. Before my explosive laughter and my dramatic exit, he had spent a solid 20 minutes trying to brainwash me with the gospel of Spencer. He had leaned across his massive mahogany desk, tapping that insulting $10,000 check, and lecturing me about my white brother-in-law and his supposed business brilliance. Caldwell had the absolute nerve to explain the cultural significance of the Sweet Auburn district to me, as if my own grandfather had not walked those very streets. He told me the heritage land was deteriorating and that my family lacked the capital and the vision to develop it properly. According to Caldwell, Spencer was swooping in like a knight in shining armor to save us all. He claimed Spencer had drawn up visionary plans for luxury mixed-use condos that would revitalize the area and bring immense wealth to the family. Caldwell said my parents were incredibly grateful for Spencer and his willingness to take on such a massive burden. He spoke to me like I was a slow child who could not comprehend basic economics. He told me I was holding my family back from generational wealth simply because I was being stubborn and emotional. I walked into the parking garage and sat in the driver's seat of my car, gripping the steering wheel. I thought about my mother Brenda and my father Winston. Their blind worship of Spencer was nothing short of sickening. From the day my sister Brianna brought him home, my parents had treated him like absolute royalty. Spencer was a fast-talking real estate broker who wore expensive loafers without socks and threw around corporate buzzwords like synergy and market disruption. Because he was white and carried himself with that unearned, aggressive confidence, my parents immediately decided he was the golden ticket to elevating our family status in the neighborhood. They bragged about him to the neighbors constantly. They sat in the front pew at church and talked loudly about their son-in-law, the developer. Meanwhile, my husband Malik, a brilliant black man with 2 master's degrees who dedicated his life to educating and uplifting our youth, was treated like the hired help. They constantly undermined Malik, asking him when he was going to get a real job and stop relying on a public servant salary. They never respected us, and they made sure we knew it. But the real truth was sitting right there on the paper Caldwell had shoved in my face. I had taken a quick, high-resolution photo of the quitclaim deed with my phone before I tossed it back at him, and now I pulled the image up on my screen to study it further. I zoomed in on the fine print. The document was not just a simple transfer of property, it was a complete surrender of my grandfather and his legacy. Grandfather Theodore had specifically placed that land in a family trust, requiring the signatures of all surviving heirs to authorize any sale or major development. He knew my parents were easily swayed by shiny things and empty promises, so he wanted to make sure I had a legal say. He trusted my analytical mind even when I was just a teenager. And looking at this contract, I saw exactly why he did it. The purchasing entity was listed as a limited liability company called Apex Heritage Holdings. Caldwell had proudly stated that this was Spencer and his flagship investment group. But as a senior forensic accountant, I knew a fraudulent shell company when I saw one. The address listed for Apex Heritage Holdings was a registered agent Dropbox in Delaware. The operating agreement referenced in the appendix was boilerplate garbage printed straight from the internet. There was no real capital backing this venture. Spencer was using my parents and their desperation for social status to secure the land for free so he could leverage it for a massive commercial bank loan. The contract also included an aggressive indemnification clause, meaning that if the project went bankrupt, my parents would be fully liable for the debt, while Spencer and his company would walk away untouched. It was a textbook predatory real estate scheme, and my parents were too blinded by their worship of him to see the trap. And the most beautiful part of this entire disaster was that Spencer had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. My parents were so busy painting me as the crazy, estranged daughter that they completely omitted my actual career progression. They told Caldwell I was just a lowly number cruncher with an unstable emotional track record. They never mentioned that I had been headhunted by Vanguard Investment Group. They never mentioned that I led a team of 30 auditors whose sole job was to sniff out fraudulent commercial loan applications, just like the one Spencer was trying to pull off. As I sat there analyzing the trap he had set for my family, my phone vibrated in my hand. It was a text message from an unknown number, but I knew the cadence of the typing instantly. The message read, "Zola, please be reasonable. We need your signature by Friday. Do not ruin this massive opportunity for your sister." It was my mother, Brenda. 7 years of absolute silence. 7 years of missing my birthday, missing my wedding anniversary, and completely ignoring my existence. And the very first time she reaches out is to act as an errand girl for her precious white son-in-law. I read the text again and felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation and guilt trips that used to paralyze me in my 20s simply did not work anymore. I typed a cold and calculated response. I told her I would not discuss sensitive legal matters over a text message, but I was willing to meet the whole family for dinner at Belmont's this Saturday night to finalize our business. I told her the reservation would be under my name, and if they wanted my signature, they had better be there on time. She replied instantly with a simple thumbs-up emoji. No asking how I have been, no telling me she missed me. Just a transactional confirmation. I locked my phone and started the engine of my car. Let them think they had won. Let Caldwell assure them that my demand for a dinner was just a final desperate plea for attention. They thought I was going to show up to that restaurant and quietly accept their $10,000 bribe. They had no idea they were walking straight into an ambush. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto the busy Atlanta streets. The afternoon sun was glaring, but my mind was completely cold and focused. I pressed the button on my steering wheel and called Malik. The phone rang twice before his deep, calming voice filled the car. He asked how the meeting with Caldwell went and if I survived the condescension. I told him about the $10,000 check and the quitclaim deed. I told him how they tried to use my mental health as a weapon to force my signature. Malik let out a low, steady breath. He has always been my rock, and hearing the quiet anger in his silence only made my resolve stronger. I told him they wanted me to hand over grandfather Theodore and his land in Sweet Auburn to a company called Apex Heritage Holdings. I heard the sound of papers shuffling on his end of the line. Malik asked me to repeat the name of the company. I said it again slowly and explained that it was a shell corporation registered to Spencer. Malik let out a rich, booming laugh that mirrored my own reaction in Caldwell's office. He told me that was the most poetic mistake they could have possibly made. As the director of the Educational Heritage Foundation, Malik had spent the last 6 months aggressively securing historical preservation status for key properties in the Sweet Auburn district. Grandfather Theodore and his land was right in the middle of their newly approved protection zone. Malik told me he had the foundation and their official land appraisal files right on his desk. He said he would pack them in his briefcase and meet me at home so we could get ready for the dinner. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, humid breeze. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal dress that exuded authority, while Malik wore a perfectly fitted navy suit. He looked every bit the powerful executive he was, but I knew my family would only see the public school teacher they had mocked for years. We pulled up to Belmont's, which was easily one of the most expensive and pretentious restaurants in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and a jazz pianist played softly in the corner. The valet took our keys, and we walked through the heavy glass doors feeling the cold rush of the air conditioning. The host led us past tables of wealthy socialites to a private dining alcove in the back. My family was already seated and the visual was almost comical. My mother Brenda was draped in a ridiculous amount of flashy gold jewelry that screamed new money and security. My father Winston wore a stiff dark suit and an expression of profound irritation as if simply looking at me was a massive burden on his schedule. Brianna sat next to him looking like a polished reality television star with her perfectly blown-out hair and a gaudy designer handbag placed entirely too close to the breadbasket so everyone could see the logo. And then there was Spencer. He sat at the very head of the table like a medieval king holding court. He wore a ridiculously tight navy blazer over a plain white t-shirt paired with expensive loafers without socks. He had a shiny silver watch that he made sure to flick his wrist to check every 2 minutes. As soon as we approached the table, the atmosphere turned instantly toxic. No one stood up to greet us. No one offered a hug or a simple hello. It had been 7 years since we were all in the same room, and their first reaction was pure judgment. My mother looked Malik up and down and visibly wrinkled her nose. She asked him if he had to rent that suit for the occasion. She said it was a shame he was still playing dress-up on a public servant's salary when Spencer could easily get him a discount at a real menswear store. Malik simply smiled his calm, disarming smile and pulled out my chair for me before taking his own seat. He did not take the bait. He knew exactly how much power he was holding in his leather briefcase, resting quietly by his feet. Winston chimed in right after telling Malik he hoped he was not expecting the family to pay for his dinner tonight. Winston said this dinner was meant to be a quick business transaction to fix my mistakes and that Malik should be grateful they even allowed him in the building. I felt my jaw tighten, but Malik placed a warm hand on my knee under the table, giving me a gentle squeeze. Spencer leaned back and snapped his fingers aggressively at a passing waiter. He loudly ordered a vintage bottle of Cabernet without consulting anyone else at the table, making sure to enunciate the steep price so the entire alcove could hear. He looked at me with a smug, satisfied grin and said he was glad I finally decided to stop throwing tantrums and act like a rational adult. He told me I should be thanking him on my hands and knees for bailing the family out of a useless piece of dirt. He claimed his new condo development was going to generate millions for the family legacy, and that the $10,000 I was getting was basically a charitable donation on his part. He said he was doing me a huge favor because he knew how much Malik struggled to provide for me in this economy. Brianna let out a high-pitched giggle and reached over to rub Spencer on his arm. She told me I should listen to her husband because he actually understands how the real world works, unlike people who hide behind pointless government jobs. She looked at Malik with absolute disdain and told him maybe Spencer could hire him to do some landscaping work when the construction starts. I unfolded my crisp linen napkin and placed it on my lap, taking my absolute time. I looked around the table at the people who were supposed to be my blood. Winston was nodding along with every arrogant word that fell out of Spencer and his mouth. Brenda looked at me with sheer expectation, waiting for me to bow my head and submit to their golden boy. They genuinely believed they held all the cards. They thought my silence was intimidation. They thought the fancy restaurant and the expensive wine would make me feel small and compliant. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the iced water the waiter had just poured. I set the crystal glass down gently, hearing the soft clink against the table. I looked right at Spencer, letting a sharp, cold smile spread across my face, and asked him exactly how his commercial loan application with Vanguard Investment Group was going. Spencer and his face drained of color. The smug satisfaction that had been plastered across his features vanished in an instant, replaced by a pale mask of sheer panic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as his eyes darted from me to Malik and back again. My father Winston frowned clearly, annoyed by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He demanded to know what I was talking about and told me to stop speaking in riddles. My mother Brenda crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her cheap gold bracelets clinking together. She told me I was being rude to Spencer and that I needed to show some respect for the man who was trying to save our family. I did not break eye contact with Spencer. I asked him if he wanted to tell them, or if he preferred that I do the honors. Spencer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a thick, crisp folder. I tossed it onto the center of the table right next to the ridiculous vintage Cabernet he had ordered. I told my parents they should really pay attention to what was inside that folder before they handed over my grandfather and his legacy. I looked directly at my father and explained that Apex Heritage Holdings was not a massive development firm. It was a shell company, a ghost entity registered to a Dropbox in Delaware with absolutely zero capital backing it. Brianna let out a loud, dramatic scoff. She slammed her hand on the table and accused me of being jealous of her husband and his success. She said Spencer had millions in backing, and that I was just a bitter woman trying to ruin her perfect life. That is when Malik finally made his move. The man my family had spent years calling a broke public school teacher calmly unlatched his leather briefcase. The click of the metal locks echoed loudly in our quiet dining alcove, cutting through the background noise of the jazz pianist. Malik pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the State Historical Preservation Society. He slid them across the table toward my father. Malik spoke with a smooth, authoritative tone that immediately commanded the room. He explained that, as the director of the Educational Heritage Foundation, he had successfully petitioned the city to protect the Sweet Auburn district. Malik told my parents that the land my grandfather left behind was now officially designated as a historical landmark. He pushed the appraisal files closer to Winston. He said his foundation had recently appraised the property, and its true market value was not the pennies Spencer was claiming it was worth. It was valued at over $4 million due to its historical significance and prime location. Malik smiled warmly at my mother and said he knew they were worried about his finances, but managing a $50 million endowment fund kept him quite comfortable. The silence at the table was deafening. Winston stared at the official city documents, his eyes wide with shock. Brenda looked from Malik to the papers and then to Spencer, her mouth hanging slightly open. Brianna looked completely lost, as if we were speaking a foreign language she could not comprehend. Spencer was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were turning white. He finally found his voice and accused Malik of fabricating the documents. He pointed a shaking finger at Malik and called him a liar, saying a broke teacher could never pull off something like this. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I told Spencer it was bold of him to call anyone a liar when his entire life was a house of cards. I opened my folder and pulled out the financial summaries I had compiled. I did not need to raise my voice because the cold, hard facts were devastating enough. I read the numbers aloud, detailing the exact amount of debt Spencer was drowning in. I explained to my parents that Spencer had leveraged everything to invest in a series of disastrous cryptocurrency ventures. He had lost it all, and the banks were aggressively calling in his loans. I watched the color drain from Brianna and her face as I revealed that her husband had not paid the mortgage on their luxury townhouse in over 4 months. I told her the foreclosure notices were probably sitting in a hidden pile somewhere in their house right now. Brianna turned to Spencer, her voice trembling as she asked him if it was true. Spencer refused to look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the table, his jaw clenched tight. I pulled out another document from my folder. It was a public record search I had run that morning. I slid it over to my father and asked him if he recognized the address. Winston squinted at the paper, and his face went completely gray. It was his own home address. I explained that Spencer had secretly taken out a second mortgage on my parents and their house by forging my father and his signature on the loan documents. He had drained their home equity to cover his massive margin calls. Brenda let out a small, horrified gasp and pressed her hands over her mouth. She shook her head slowly, refusing to believe it. She reached out and touched Spencer on his arm, pleading with him to tell me I was wrong. She asked him to show us the development plans he had promised. Spencer jerked his arm away from her touch, his face twisting into a nasty defensive scowl. He did not have any plans to show. The illusion he had built over the past 7 years was rapidly disintegrating right before their eyes. I turned my attention back to my father. I asked him how he thought Spencer was planning to finance this fake condo project without any money. Winston stammered weakly, saying Spencer had investors lined up. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I told my father there were no investors. Spencer was trying to use the quitclaim deed to steal the sweet Auburn land free and clear, so he could use it as collateral for a massive commercial loan from Vanguard Investment Group. I let that sink in for a moment, watching my parents struggle to process the fact that their golden boy was nothing but a desperate con artist. I explained that Spencer needed all of our signatures because the bank required clear title to approve the funds. He was going to take the loan money, pay off his personal debts, and let the bank foreclose on my grandfather and his land when he inevitably defaulted. He was planning to sacrifice our family legacy and leave my parents homeless just to save his own skin. I sat back in my chair feeling a profound sense of peace. I told them this was exactly why I laughed in the lawyer in his office. Spencer had spent weeks crafting this elaborate scam, entirely unaware that the commercial loan application he submitted to Vanguard had landed directly on my desk. He did not know that I was the senior director of risk audit for the very institution he was trying to defraud. Winston looked at me, his expression a mixture of absolute horror and realization. He finally understood the magnitude of the mistake he had made. He had alienated his own daughter, the only person in the family with the power and the knowledge to protect them from a predator. He looked at Malik, seeing him not as the broke teacher he had mocked, but as the powerful executive who had completely outsmarted them all. The power dynamics at the table had inverted entirely, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the fallout. Malik met me at our home just as the sun was beginning to dip below the Atlanta skyline, casting long golden shadows across our driveway. He stepped out of his car, holding the thick leather briefcase that contained the official appraisal files from his foundation. Seeing him standing there so calm and completely collected instantly washed away any residual anxiety I had from the law office. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and quiet confidence. I had changed into a sharp charcoal dress that felt much more like armor than regular clothing. We did not say much as we got into my car. The drive to Belmont's was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence built on years of mutual trust and respect. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the restaurant where the valet promptly opened our doors. The heavy, humid evening air clung to my skin for just a second before we stepped through the massive glass doors into the fiercely air-conditioned lobby. Belmont's was exactly the kind of establishment that intimidated everyday people on purpose. The floors were polished imported marble that reflected the warm light of the massive crystal chandeliers hanging high above. A live jazz pianist was playing softly in the corner, blending with the low, steady hum of wealthy patrons discussing their stock portfolios and summer homes. The host greeted us with a tight professional smile and led us past tables of local socialites to a private dining alcove tucked far away in the back of the room. As we approached, I could see my family already seated around a large circular table. My stomach tightened for a fraction of a second, but Malik placed his warm hand on the small of my back, steadying me without saying a single word. My mother Brenda was the very first to spot us walking over. She was draped in an excessive amount of shiny gold jewelry that clashed terribly with her bright floral blouse. It was the exact aesthetic of someone trying desperately to prove to strangers that they had money. My father Winston sat rigidly beside her, checking his expensive watch with a look of profound annoyance, as if our mere presence was an unbearable inconvenience to his schedule. Across from them sat my sister Brianna, who looked like she had spent the entire afternoon at a luxury salon just to prepare for this dinner. She had intentionally placed her oversized designer handbag on the empty chair next to her, making absolutely sure the prominent logo was facing outward for everyone to see. And right at the center of it all, taking up way more space than necessary, sat Spencer. He wore a tight navy blazer over a plain white t-shirt, leaning back in his chair with an aura of unearned superiority. As we finally reached the table, the air in the alcove grew immediately cold. No one stood up to greet us. No one offered a warm smile or even asked how our drive across town was. My mother looked me up and down, her eyes stopping critically on my dress before sliding over to Judge Malik. She let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and leaned forward, resting her elbows heavily on the white tablecloth. She looked right at Malik and asked if he had managed to rent that suit for the entire weekend, or if he had to return it to the discount store by tomorrow morning. She said it was a real shame he was still trying to look the part of a successful man when everyone in the family knew public school teachers barely made enough to cover basic living expenses. Malik did not flinch at all. He offered her a polite, tight-lipped smile and gently pulled out my chair for me before sitting down right next to me. Winston immediately chimed in, pointing a thick, heavy finger in our direction. He told us we were incredibly lucky. They even agreed to a dinner after the disrespectful and erratic stunt I pulled in Caldwell and his office earlier that day. He said he hoped Malik was not expecting a free meal tonight, because this was strictly a business meeting to fix my emotional mistakes and nothing else. Spencer chuckled loudly, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at Malik with an expression of deep, condescending pity that made my blood boil beneath the surface. Spencer snapped his fingers aggressively in the air, signaling a passing waiter. The waiter rushed over, looking slightly flustered by the rude gesture. Spencer did not even look the man in the eye. He just pointed vaguely at the leather-bound wine list and demanded their absolute most expensive vintage Cabernet. He made sure to speak loudly enough so that the surrounding tables could hear him throwing his financial weight around. The waiter nodded quickly and hurried away, while Spencer turned his full attention back to me. He draped his arm casually over the back of Brianna and her chair, looking at me like I was some pathetic charity case. He told me he was glad I finally decided to stop throwing tantrums and face reality like an adult. He said the $10,000 check waiting for me was a massive personal favor on his part, because the heritage land in Sweet Auburn was nothing but a useless pile of dirt, draining the family resources. According to his grand speech, his new luxury condo project was going to elevate the family name and bring in millions of dollars of generational wealth. He told me I should be thanking him on my hands and knees for bailing us out of a bad investment. He said he knew exactly how much Malik struggled to provide for me in this terrible economy, and that his generous money would help us fix up our modest lifestyle. Brianna let out a sharp little laugh and rested her manicured hand on Spencer and his chest. She told me I should really listen to her smart husband because he actually understood how the real corporate world worked, unlike people who hid behind pointless government salaries and union protections. She looked directly at Malik, her brown eyes full of absolute disdain. She told Malik that when the heavy construction started on the new condos, Spencer might be able to pull some strings and find him a manual labor job landscaping the property. She said it would be a really good way for him to earn some extra cash, so I would not have to keep acting out for attention from my parents. The sheer arrogance radiating from their side of the table was absolutely suffocating. They sat there basking in their own manufactured glory, entirely convinced that we were so far beneath them. They thought this dinner was going to be a quick, easy surrender, where I bowed my head and signed away my grandfather and his legacy. I slowly unfolded my crisp linen napkin and placed it on my lap, taking a long, slow sip of my ice water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The waiter returned a few moments later, carrying the incredibly expensive bottle of Cabernet that Spencer had practically shouted for. He went through the entire performative ritual of presenting the label and uncorking it while my family watched with reverent attention. Spencer swirled the dark red liquid in his glass, taking a loud, obnoxious sip before nodding his approval to the waiter. Once the staff finally retreated back into the bustling restaurant, my mother decided it was time to deploy her ultimate weapon. Brenda leaned across the table and suddenly her entire demeanor shifted. The harsh, judgmental glare she had just directed at Malik vanished completely and was instantly replaced by a mask of deep maternal sorrow. Her eyes welled up with tears that arrived right on cue. She reached across the white tablecloth and tried to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled it back to pick up my water glass. Brenda sniffled loudly, making sure the surrounding tables could hear her performance. She told me my father and she had spent the last 7 years agonizing over my absence. She said they cried themselves to sleep wondering where they went wrong and why their youngest daughter had so cruelly abandoned her family. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin and told me that family was the most important thing in the world. According to her, it was finally time for me to grow up, let go of my petty grudges, and repay the debt I owed to the people who gave me life. She said a good Christian daughter would never stand in the way of her family and their financial blessing. She pointed a trembling finger at the thick manila envelope sitting next to Spencer and begged me to just sign the quitclaim deed so we could all finally be a happy, healed family again. Winston chimed in right on schedule, playing the stern but forgiving patriarch. He adjusted his tie and told me my mother was right. He said I had caused them enough public embarrassment by cutting contact, and that people at their church were constantly asking uncomfortable questions about my whereabouts. He told me giving up my grandfather and his useless piece of land was the absolute least I could do to make up for all the emotional distress I had put them through. Spencer, sensing that my parents were wearing me down, confidently slid the quitclaim deed and a heavy silver pen across the table until it bumped right against my dinner plate. He tapped the paper with 2 fingers and gave me a patronizing smile, telling me to just sign on the dotted line so we could enjoy our expensive meal in peace. I looked down at the contract and then back up at the 3 of them. Brianna was sitting there nodding along with my parents, as if I was a criminal who was finally turning herself in. I felt Malik shift slightly beside me, his presence a steady anchor against the overwhelming wave of gaslighting. I did not raise my voice, but when I spoke, the temperature at the table seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I looked directly into my mother and her fake teary eyes. I asked her if she really wanted to talk about abandonment tonight. I asked her if she wanted to discuss the concept of family loyalty while sitting in a restaurant that cost more than my first car. Brenda blinked in confusion, dropping her napkin to her lap. Her fake tears instantly dried up as she realized I was not falling for the guilt trip. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I reminded her of a sunny day in May, exactly 7 years ago. I painted the picture clearly, so none of them could deny it. I was 22 years old, sitting in a massive college auditorium, wearing a heavy black graduation gown. I told them how I sat there for 3 straight hours, scanning the crowd of thousands of cheering parents looking for just one familiar face. I described the crushing humiliation of walking across that stage, accepting my accounting degree with highest honors, to the sound of absolute silence from my designated section. Every other student around me had families holding up signs and tossing flowers and screaming their names. I had an empty row of folding chairs. I watched Winston swallow hard, his eyes darting away from mine. He reached for his water glass, but his hand was slightly unsteady. I turned my gaze to Brianna, who suddenly looked very interested in her empty bread plate. I reminded the entire table exactly where my loving parents were on that important day. They were not stuck in awful Atlanta traffic. They were not dealing with an unforeseen medical emergency. They had intentionally skipped the biggest academic achievement of my life to drive across the state to an exclusive luxury bridal boutique. I told them I remembered exactly how I found out, because Brianna had plastered it all over her social media pages. She had posted dozens of photos of my mother and my father drinking complimentary champagne and wiping away tears of joy while Brianna modeled custom wedding gowns. Gowns that were paid for using the college tuition fund they had secretly drained from my bank account just months prior. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but she could not find a single word to defend herself. The fake sorrow she had tried to weaponize just moments ago evaporated completely, leaving behind nothing but cold, defensive guilt. Winston tried to puff out his chest and regain control of the narrative. He told me I was being overly dramatic about a simple scheduling conflict, and that a wedding only happens once in a lifetime, so they had to prioritize Brianna. He said graduation ceremonies were long and boring anyway, and I was smart enough to know they were proud of me in spirit. I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head at the absolute delusion of his statement. Proud in spirit but completely absent in reality, I replied, matching his stern tone. I looked at Spencer, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of annoyance and impatience. He clearly did not care about our family history or my graduation. He only cared about the piece of paper sitting in front of me. He tapped the table again and told me we could unpack all of this childhood trauma in therapy later. But right now, we had a multi-million-dollar business deal to execute. He said my parents had apologized enough, and it was time for me to be the bigger person. I turned my attention entirely to Spencer, staring at him until he squirmed in his seat. I told him that he had absolutely no right to speak on family matters he knew nothing about. I told him he was nothing more than a parasite wearing a fancy suit trying to feed off a family that was too desperate for validation to realize they were being drained. The shock on Spencer and his face was almost comical. Nobody in this family had ever spoken to him like that. My parents gasped in unison, and Brianna practically shrieked, demanding that I apologize to her husband immediately. I completely ignored them. I pointed at the quitclaim deed resting against my plate. I told them that my grandfather left me that specific piece of land because he was the only person in this bloodline who knew they would eventually try to sacrifice my future for their own comfort. Grandfather Theodore knew they would blindly throw all their remaining assets at a flashy illusion just to impress people they did not even like. He wanted to make sure I had a tangible piece of leverage to protect myself when the time finally came. I slid the silver pen slowly across the slick white tablecloth until it clinked against Spencer and his oversized wineglass. I told my parents I did not owe them a single dime or a single drop of loyalty because I had already paid my debt to this family on the day they stole my education to buy a white dress. Spencer let out a loud, exasperated sigh that sounded like a tire slowly losing air. He picked up his heavy silver pen, the one I had just pushed away, and began tapping it rhythmically against his water glass. He completely ignored the heavy emotional truth I had just laid out on the table about my stolen college fund. To him, my pain was just a minor inconvenience standing in the way of his payday. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his expensive navy blazer, and looked at me with a sickeningly patient smile. It was the exact kind of condescending smile that made you want to scream. He spoke in a slow, measured tone, like he was trying to explain basic math to a toddler. He told me I was letting my petty personal grievances blind me to the much bigger economic picture. He raised his hands expansively, painting an imaginary picture in the air above our table. According to Spencer, the Sweet Auburn district was nothing but a dying neighborhood full of blighted properties clinging to a forgotten past. He actually used the word dilapidated to describe the vibrant historic streets where my grandfather had built his legacy from the ground up. Spencer puffed out his chest and declared that the area needed visionaries like him to step in and clean it up. He spoke about his luxury condo project as if he was gifting the city a modern masterpiece. He described glass towers, high-end coffee shops, and exclusive rooftop lounges that would finally bring a better class of people to the neighborhood. He did not even realize the deeply racist undertones of his own words, or maybe he just did not care. My parents sat there nodding along, completely hypnotized by his hollow corporate buzzwords. They were so desperate to be associated with his fake wealth that they were actively cheering for the destruction of their own heritage. Spencer took another large gulp of his vintage Cabernet, swirling the red liquid around his mouth before swallowing loudly. He pointed his wine glass directly at me and stated that holding on to a useless plot of dirt out of misplaced nostalgia was financially irresponsible. He claimed his development firm Apex Heritage Holdings was going to single-handedly revitalize the entire block. He told my father that once the condos were built, the family name would be immortalized on a small bronze plaque in the lobby, and that alone was worth more than the land itself. The absolute audacity of this man sitting there, telling a black family that he was doing them a massive favor by gentrifying their history and putting a plaque in a building they would never be able to afford to live in, was staggering. He talked about the community like it was an eyesore waiting to be bulldozed for his personal profit. Brianna clapped her hands together lightly, her eyes shining with absolute adoration for her husband. She told me I should be taking notes instead of acting so defensive. She said Spencer had investors begging to throw money at him, and that we were incredibly lucky he decided to keep this project in the family. My mother Brenda immediately agreed, leaning across the table to add her own ridiculous commentary. She told me Spencer was a true visionary and that I was just too stuck in the past to see how much he was sacrificing to help us out of the goodness of his heart. Winston nodded solemnly, adding that Grandfather Theodore would have wanted the land to be used to elevate the family status rather than sitting there collecting weeds. Spencer soaked up their praise like a sponge, his ego swelling until it practically filled the entire dining alcove. The jazz music playing softly in the background felt entirely out of place against the toxic garbage spilling from his mouth. He then turned his attention away from me and focused his condescending gaze entirely on Malik. Malik had been sitting quietly the entire time, his posture perfectly straight, his expression completely unreadable. Spencer rested his elbows on the table and laced his fingers together, leaning toward my husband with a predatory grin. He told Malik that he knew it must be hard sitting at a table with real professionals while bringing home a miserable public school salary. He said he respected the fact that Malik tried to help inner-city kids, but that at the end of the day, charity did not pay the mortgage. Spencer let out a short, arrogant chuckle and said he was actually willing to throw Malik a bone. He loudly announced to the table that when the heavy construction started on the luxury condos, he would need reliable men to handle the physical labor. He told Malik he could probably pull some strings with the site foreman to get him a job, carrying bricks, clearing debris, or digging trenches. He actually looked Malik up and down, pretending to assess his physical build, and said he looked strong enough to handle a shovel and a wheelbarrow. Spencer said the overtime pay for manual labor would be a nice little bonus for us, and might even help Malik afford a suit that actually fit him properly instead of wearing off-the-rack garbage to a nice restaurant. The blatant disrespect hung heavy in the air. My father, Winston, let out a low chuckle of agreement, muttering something about how hard physical work builds character for men who lack ambition. Brianna covered her mouth to hide a nasty little smirk, acting as if her husband had just delivered the punchline to a brilliant joke. My mother simply looked at Malik with eyes full of pity, shaking her head slowly. They were all waiting for Malik to lose his temper. They wanted him to yell or flip the table or cause a scene so they could point their fingers and call him an angry thug. They wanted him to validate all the horrible stereotypes they held against him so they could feel justified in their prejudice. My heart was pounding furiously against my ribs, my hands clenching into tight fists under the white tablecloth. I was absolutely ready to tear Spencer apart right then and there and expose every single lie he had ever told. But Malik simply reached under the table and placed his large, warm hand over my clenched fists. His touch was incredibly grounding, cutting through the red haze of my anger. He ran his thumb soothingly over my knuckles, silently telling me to hold my fire. Malik did not break eye contact with Spencer for even a second. His face remained completely calm, smooth, and unbothered. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of the rage that I knew was simmering just beneath the surface. Malik just looked at Spencer the way a seasoned chess master might look at a particularly foolish opponent who just sacrificed his queen on the very first move. The stark contrast between Spencer and his loud, desperate need to dominate the room and Malik and his quiet, immovable power was incredible to witness. Spencer sat there grinning smugly, thinking he had just delivered the ultimate humiliating blow. But he had no idea he was just blindly walking straight into the massive trap we had meticulously set for him. Malik did not raise his voice. He did not slam his fist on the table or demand respect the way Spencer constantly did. Instead, he simply picked up his crystal water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the sides of the glass, a sharp sound that somehow cut right through the heavy tension in the dining alcove. He set the glass down exactly where it had been resting before and reached a hand inside the breast pocket of his tailored navy suit. The fabric moved smoothly, showing the high quality of the tailoring that my mother had just insulted minutes ago. Spencer watched him with a smirk, probably expecting Malik to pull out a cheap wallet or maybe a union card to defend his teaching career. My parents leaned in slightly, their faces caught somewhere between disgust and curiosity. Malik pulled out a sleek matte black business card with embossed gold lettering. He placed his index finger on the center of the card and slid it slowly across the smooth white tablecloth. It glided effortlessly, stopping right in the center of the table, equidistant from my father and Spencer. The gold foil caught the light from the chandelier overhead, gleaming brightly. Winston frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together as he leaned forward to read the text. Brenda squinted her eyes, trying to make out the words from her seat. Malik folded his hands together on the table and looked directly at Spencer. His voice was smooth and resonant, carrying a natural authority that commanded absolute attention. He told Spencer that he appreciated the incredibly generous offer for manual labor, but he was going to have to decline. He explained that his schedule was already quite full these days. Malik then looked at my parents and told them that while he loved his time teaching in the public school system, he had actually left that position nearly 5 years ago. My mother let out a small, confused breath, looking from Malik to the business card on the table. Malik went on to explain that after leaving the classroom, he realized he could make a much larger impact by protecting the history and the educational resources of our communities. He told them he was the founder and current director of the Educational Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization backed by a coalition of private investors and municipal grants. He spoke humbly, but the numbers he casually dropped were staggering. He mentioned that his foundation currently managed a $50 million endowment fund dedicated exclusively to purchasing and preserving historic Black properties across the Southeast. The smug smile on Spencer and his face began to crack. His eyes darted from the gold-embossed card to Malik and his face. The arrogant posture he had held all evening suddenly seemed to deflate as the reality of Malik and his true position started to settle over the table. Brianna looked completely lost, her mouth slightly open as she tried to comprehend how the man she just offered a landscaping job to was actually managing millions of dollars. Winston picked up the business card, holding it carefully by the edges as if it were a fragile artifact. He read the title director out loud, his voice barely above a whisper. But Malik was not finished. He leaned forward just a fraction, holding the entire table completely captive. He told Spencer that his foundation had been paying very close attention to the Sweet Auburn district lately. He explained that it was a vital piece of local history that was constantly being threatened by predatory developers who wanted to build cheap luxury condos and erase the legacy of the people who built the neighborhood. Spencer swallowed hard, a visible lump moving in his throat. Malik smiled a genuine warm smile that did not reach his eyes. He told the table that he had spent the last 6 months working directly with the city council and the State Historical Society. Malik locked eyes with my father and delivered the final crushing blow. He announced that as of yesterday morning, the exact parcel of land left by grandfather Theodore had been officially placed under an ironclad historical preservation order. He stated clearly and calmly that the land was now protected by state law. He looked Spencer dead in the eye and told him that not a single bulldozer, not a single backhoe, and not a single construction crew would ever be allowed to touch that dirt. He said there would be no glass towers, no high-end coffee shops, and absolutely no bronze plaques in the lobby. The land belonged to the history of the city, and it was completely untouchable by any commercial developer. Brianna kept blinking rapidly as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. She looked at her husband, waiting for him to laugh and say this was all a ridiculous joke. She nudged Spencer, expecting him to pull out his phone and call a powerful lawyer friend to fix it. But Spencer did not move. He just stared at the white tablecloth, his breathing becoming shallow and fast. The terrifying reality was crashing down on him. My mother Brenda finally found her voice, though it was shaky and weak. She asked Malik what he meant by preservation order, and if that meant the family could not sell the land at all. Malik nodded politely and explained that the land could theoretically be sold, but only to another preservation entity and never for commercial development. Its market value for a condo project was now exactly 0. He explained that the foundation had actually appraised the historical value of the land at over $4 million, but that value was locked into its preservation status. He told them his foundation was fully prepared to purchase the land at a fair market value to turn it into a community education center, honoring Grandfather Theodore and his legacy, but they would only do so through the proper legal channels and definitely not through a shady shell company. The dining alcove went completely dead silent. The lively chatter from the main restaurant outside our private area seemed to fade away entirely. The jazz pianist was still playing a smooth melody, but inside our little bubble, the air was completely devoid of sound. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Winston sat frozen, staring blankly at the gold lettering on the business card still pinched between his fingers. Brenda looked like she had just been slapped across the face, the color draining completely from her cheeks. She looked at Malik with a mixture of profound shock and deep rising panic. Spencer looked like he was going to be physically sick. The vintage Cabernet he had been sipping so proudly was now sitting ignored next to his white knuckles. His grand master plan, his visionary condo project, his entire ticket out of whatever financial hole he had dug for himself was completely destroyed by the calm, soft-spoken black man he had spent the last hour treating like dirt. He could not build on the land, even if I signed the quitclaim deed right now. The property was completely useless to him. Malik had outmaneuvered him on every possible level without ever raising his voice or breaking a sweat. The silence stretched on thick and suffocating as my family sat there realizing they had just backed the wrong horse and alienated the only person who actually had real power. Brianna was the very first person to break the suffocating silence that had settled over our private dining alcove. She slammed both of her manicured hands down hard onto the white tablecloth, rattling the expensive crystal glasses and the heavy silver flatware. She pointed a shaking finger directly across the table at Malik, completely abandoning any pretense of upscale restaurant etiquette. Her voice rose to a shrill, desperate pitch that made several heads turn from the main dining room outside our secluded area. She accused Malik of being a jealous liar and a complete fraud. She claimed that he had fabricated the entire story and probably printed those fake historical preservation documents at a local public library just to sabotage her husband. Brianna insisted that Spencer was a highly respected real estate genius with powerful connections all over the city, and that the municipal government would never dare block his visionary development plans. She turned wildly toward my parents, begging them not to listen to a single word my husband was saying. She was so desperate to protect the fragile illusion of her perfect, wealthy life that she was willing to completely detach herself from reality. My father, Winston, suddenly snapped out of his frozen state of shock. The deeply ingrained patriarchal ego inside him simply could not handle being made a fool of, especially not by the black son-in-law he had spent years treating like an absolute peasant. Instead of turning his righteous anger toward the white man sitting at the head of the table who was actively trying to scam him, Winston directed all of his misplaced fury right at me. He brought his heavy fist down onto the table with a loud thud that made my mother jump in her seat. His face flushed a deep, angry red, and the veins in his neck stood out prominently against his stiff white collar. He leaned far across the table, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly at my face. He told me I had crossed a line tonight that could never be uncrossed. He demanded that I rein in my husband immediately and stop this embarrassing charade. Winston lowered his voice into a vicious, threatening growl. He said, "If I did not pick up that silver pen and sign the quitclaim deed right this very second, he was going to call Attorney Caldwell first thing on Monday morning. He threatened to cut me completely out of the family trust forever. He promised to disinherit me legally and make absolutely sure that I never saw a single penny of the generational wealth he and my mother had worked their entire lives to accumulate." I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not flinch at his loud, booming voice. I just sat there perfectly still and let his empty, desperate threats wash completely over me. I looked at my father and felt a slow, cold smirk spread across my face. The absolute sheer irony of his ultimate threat was almost too sweet to ignore. I kept my voice remarkably calm and steady, cutting right through his loud, aggressive bluster. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You cannot disinherit me from something you do not even own." Winston stopped mid-breath, his face instantly twisting into a mask of deep, genuine confusion. He blinked several times, stuttering slightly, as he told me I was talking out of turn and that he was the head of the estate. I did not bother arguing with his delusions. Instead, I reached out and picked up the thick legal document that Spencer had slid over to my dinner plate earlier in the evening. I held the quitclaim deed up in the air so the warm ambient light from the chandelier caught the crisp white pages. I looked directly at my father and told him he had clearly never bothered to read the actual fine print of his own father and his living trust. I explained in very slow, clear terms that when Grandfather Theodore passed away, he did not leave the sweet Auburn heritage land to my parents. He left the property entirely to the trust itself, and he had explicitly legally named me as the sole primary trustee the moment I turned 25 years old. I watched the color completely drain out of my father and his face as I laid out the brutal legal reality of his situation. I explained that my parents were merely passive beneficiaries. They were entitled to receive a small percentage of dividends if the land ever generated any passive rental income, but they possessed absolutely zero legal voting power to sell, transfer, or mortgage the property. They had no authority over the dirt they had been promising to Spencer for the last 6 months. I broke down the complex legal jargon into simple, sharp facts, exactly the way I would explain a financial crime to a federal jury. I told the table that the only reason Spencer desperately needed my signature on this specific piece of paper tonight was because the commercial bank underwriters had immediately flagged his fraudulent application. Spencer had initially tried to forge my father and his signature to transfer the land over to his fake shell company. But the bank auditors realized very quickly that Winston did not actually have the legal authority to authorize any transfer. Spencer needed my legal surrender to legitimize his massive fraud. I flipped smoothly to the third page of the contract, running my perfectly manicured fingernail down the dense blocks of text until I found exactly what I was looking for. I pointed to a deeply hidden, highly aggressive indemnification clause buried near the bottom of the page. I looked directly at my mother, who was now visibly trembling in her chair, holding a crumpled linen napkin against her chest. I told her that if I had actually been foolish enough or intimidated enough to sign this paper tonight, I would not just be handing over a piece of historic land. The clause specifically dictated that any future legal liability or financial default tied to Apex Heritage Holdings would fall directly back onto the original family trust. I made sure my words were razor sharp and impossible to misunderstand. I told my parents that when Spencer inevitably went totally bankrupt on his imaginary condo project, the commercial bank would not just seize the sweet Auburn land. They would be legally permitted to go after my parents and their personal retirement accounts, their savings and their primary residence to cover his massive outstanding debts. I told my mother that her perfect golden boy was not trying to make them rich. He was actively trying to use my parents as a human shield for his own financial crimes. He had intentionally structured the entire shady deal so that he could walk away completely clean while my parents would be left entirely alone to face the federal auditors and the aggressive bank collectors. I turned the heavy legal document around and slid it slowly right back across the tablecloth until it rested perfectly straight in front of Spencer. He looked down at the white paper like it was a highly venomous snake ready to strike, while the rest of my family sat in a stunned, horrified silence. Spencer did not touch the document. He just stared at the white paper sitting in front of his empty wine glass like it was glowing with radiation. Brianna was shaking her head violently, refusing to accept the reality that was unfolding right in front of her. She looked at me with tears of pure anger streaming down her perfectly contoured face and told me I was making all of this up just to ruin her life. She said Spencer had an entire team of wealthy investors backing Apex Heritage Holdings and that his development fund was worth tens of millions of dollars. She told my parents to stop listening to me because I was just a bitter, jealous sister trying to tear down a successful businessman. I did not even blink. I simply reached back into my designer bag and pulled out a second folder. This one was much thicker than the first. As a senior forensic accountant, I spend 40 hours a week tracking missing millions across international borders and uncovering complex corporate fraud. Taking apart Spencer and his pathetic little real estate scheme was barely a warm-up exercise for me. I opened the heavy folder and spread several printed spreadsheets across the table, right over the expensive linen tablecloth. I pointed to the very first page and told my family to look closely at the corporate registration documents for Apex Heritage Holdings. I explained that a real investment fund has a board of directors filed public disclosures and verifiable capital assets. Spencer had none of those things. I told my father that Apex was nothing more than a cheap shell company registered online for about $200 using a fake virtual office address in a strip mall in Delaware. Winston leaned forward, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers I had highlighted in bright yellow marker. I walked them through Spencer and his daily cash flow. I explained that the massive investment fund Brianna was bragging about simply did not exist. There were no silent partners. There were no private equity backers. There was absolutely zero capital sitting in his business accounts. Instead of millions of dollars in backing, I showed them exactly what Spencer actually possessed: a mountain of high-interest debt. I read the numbers aloud, letting each devastating figure land heavily in the quiet dining alcove. I told them that Spencer had maxed out 7 different business credit cards over the past 18 months, just to maintain the illusion of his wealthy lifestyle. He was using one credit line to pay the minimum balance on another, spinning a dangerous web of revolving debt that was finally collapsing in on him. I broke down the concept of check kiting and fraudulent asset inflation so clearly that even Brianna could understand it. I told her how Spencer would transfer small amounts of borrowed cash between 3 different bank accounts to make it look like his company was generating massive monthly revenue. It was a pathetic parlor trick designed to fool low-level loan officers, but to a certified forensic auditor, it was as obvious as a neon sign in a dark room. I traced the flow of funds directly from a hard money lender right into the checking account Brianna used to pay for her extravagant country club membership. I watched her face contort in pure horror as I read off the dates and the exact dollar amounts of her recent shopping sprees, proving that every single luxury she enjoyed was built on stolen time and fraudulent credit. I looked directly at Brianna and pointed to a specific line item on the bank statements. I told her the vintage Cabernet they were drinking tonight, the expensive designer handbag she had so proudly displayed on the chair next to her, and the luxury car Spencer drove, were all completely financed by predatory short-term loans. I explained that Spencer was currently drowning in so much debt that he was borrowing money at aggressive double-digit interest rates just to keep his own lights on at home. I turned my attention back to my mother Brenda, who was now clutching her chest as if she could not catch her breath. I told her that Spencer had run out of credit lines to exploit. The banks had finally cut him off and the private lenders were aggressively demanding their money back. That is exactly why he suddenly took such a deep interest in Grandfather Theodore and his heritage land. He was a desperate drowning man looking for anything solid to grab onto, and he had decided that my parents and their financial security would make the perfect life raft. I explained that his grand master plan was to use the quitclaim deed to legally steal the land from the family trust. Once he had the title free and clear, he was going to use the property as collateral to secure a massive commercial loan. He never had any intention of building luxury condos or revitalizing the sweet Auburn district. Those were just pretty buzzwords he used to manipulate my parents into trusting him. His real goal was to take the bank loan, pay off his aggressive private creditors, and walk away completely clean, leaving my family holding the bag when the bank ultimately came to collect. Winston tried to process the sheer volume of betrayal. He asked me how long Spencer had been running this scam. I looked at my father with a cold, steady gaze and told him Spencer had been financially insolvent for over 3 years. He had been bleeding money long before he ever brought up the sweet Auburn development project. He had just been waiting for the perfect moment to execute his exit strategy. and my parents, with their desperate need to be accepted by wealthy circles, had handed him the perfect opportunity on a silver platter. I pointed to the quitclaim deed sitting in front of Spencer and reminded my father of the $10,000 check Caldwell had offered me in his office. I told Winston that Spencer did not even have the cash to cover that bribe. The $10,000 was drawn from a corporate credit line that was already pushed to its absolute maximum limit. If I had actually walked into a bank to cash that check, it would have bounced immediately, leaving me with absolutely nothing, while Spencer walked away with millions of dollars in generational land. Winston slumped back in his heavy wooden chair, all the air completely knocked out of him. He looked at the spreadsheets and then looked at Spencer, the man he had worshipped, the man he had constantly compared Malik to, was nothing but a cheap con artist wearing a nice suit. Winston asked Spencer in a completely hollow voice if any of this was true. Spencer kept his eyes glued to the table, his face pale and sweating. He did not say a single word. His silence was the loudest confession anyone at the table could have ever heard. The sheer scale of the manipulation was finally sinking in for my mother. Brenda began to cry softly, but these were not the fake manipulative tears she had used earlier to try and guilt-trip me. These were the real heavy tears of a woman who was mourning the death of her own social status and the complete destruction of her perfect fake empire. The sound of my mother weeping was the only noise left in our private dining alcove. She was gasping for air, pressing the white linen napkin against her face, but it could not muffle the heavy sobs of a woman who was watching her entire fabricated reality burn to the ground. Winston was completely paralyzed. He kept his eyes locked on Spencer, waiting for the man he had treated like a king to offer even a single shred of defense. But Spencer just sat there looking absolutely pathetic. His expensive navy blazer suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He was sweating profusely, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. You could almost see the desperate gears grinding in his head as he searched for a way out of the corner I had painted him into. But there was no escape. The numbers do not lie, and I had brought all the numbers. I reached into my thick folder one final time because the financial autopsy was not quite finished. I told my father that the credit card debt and the fake shell company were actually the least of his worries. I pulled out a thick packet of paper that was heavily stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. It was a matter of public record if you knew exactly where to look and what to look for. I placed the document carefully in the center of the table right on top of the spreadsheets. I told Winston to look very closely at the property address listed on the first page. Winston reached out with hands that were trembling so violently he could barely pinch the corner of the paper. He pulled it toward himself and squinted at the bold black text. I watched the last remaining drop of color leave his face. It was the address of the house I grew up in. The 4-bedroom colonial house my parents had lived in for over 30 years, the house they had proudly paid off a decade ago. Winston looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. His voice cracked as he asked me what this document was. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any emotion. I told him it was a second mortgage, a massive, highly leveraged lien placed directly on his primary residence. I explained that about a year ago, Spencer decided he was a financial genius who could outsmart the cryptocurrency markets. He took massive, heavily leveraged positions in highly volatile digital coins, using money he had borrowed from incredibly shady private lenders. When the crypto market crashed, Spencer was hit with margin calls he could not cover. The lenders demanded their money immediately, and they were not the kind of people who politely asked for extensions. Spencer panicked. He needed a massive injection of liquid cash to save his own skin. He could not use his own luxury townhouse as collateral because he was already months behind on that mortgage. So he looked around for the easiest target he could find, and his eyes landed right on his trusting, eager-to-please father-in-law. I asked Winston if he remembered signing a large stack of routine business paperwork for Spencer a few months ago. Maybe Spencer told him he needed a quick character reference for a contractor or a signature to help expedite a routine permit. Winston let out a small, choked gasp, covering his mouth with his shaking hand. He remembered. Spencer had slipped the loan documents right into a stack of meaningless papers, and Winston trusted him so blindly that he just signed his name on the dotted line without reading a single word. Brianna finally broke out of her silent shock. She turned her entire body toward her husband, her eyes wide and frantic. She grabbed Spencer by the arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his expensive jacket. She screamed at him, demanding that he tell me I was lying. She begged him to say he did not secretly mortgage our parents' home to pay for fake internet money. Spencer violently yanked his arm away from her grasp. His face twisted into a vicious, ugly sneer. He told Brianna to shut her mouth and stop acting like a hysterical child. He looked at his wife, the woman he had pampered with stolen money, and told her that she was the reason he was in this mess in the first place, because she refused to live on a budget. The golden child dynamic shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my parents' eyes. The man they thought was a wealthy savior was actually a desperate gambling addict who hated their daughter. I leaned across the table, holding everyone captive with my words. I told them to look at the complete picture now. I explained the ultimate trap Spencer had laid for them tonight. The sweet Auburn heritage land was his absolute last lifeline. If I had walked into the restaurant tonight and bowed my head to their emotional blackmail, the result would have been catastrophic. If I had signed that quitclaim deed, Spencer would have taken the land and used it to secure the massive commercial loan from Vanguard. But I told my parents he was never going to use that loan money to build luxury condos, and he was certainly never going to use it to pay off the secret mortgage he took out on their house. He was going to use the Vanguard money to pay off the dangerous private lenders he owed for his crypto losses. He was going to secure his own escape route and leave my family to drown. I explained that within 6 months, the commercial bank would have realized the condo project was a complete sham. They would have foreclosed on the heritage land immediately. And because of the aggressive hidden indemnification clause I had pointed out earlier, the bank would have come directly for my parents to cover the rest of the defaulted debt. I looked directly into my mother and her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I told her that if I had signed that piece of paper, she and my father would have woken up a few months from now with eviction notices taped to their front door. They would have lost the family legacy land, and they would have lost the house they had lived in for 30 years, all in one single blow. The bank would have seized their retirement accounts and frozen their pensions. I spelled it out with absolute brutal clarity. If Spencer had his way tonight, my parents would have been left completely homeless on the streets of Atlanta, with absolutely nothing to their name, while Spencer filed for bankruptcy and walked away clean. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The crushing weight of their own foolishness pressed down on my parents, pinning them to their chairs. They had alienated their own flesh and blood, they had mocked my husband, and they had tried to manipulate me into signing my own death warrant, all to protect a man who was actively pushing them off a financial cliff. Winston rested his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking as he quietly began to weep right alongside my mother. The perfect, wealthy image they had sacrificed my childhood to maintain was completely, entirely gone. The heavy sound of my parents weeping was abruptly cut short by a sharp, violent crash. Spencer had finally snapped. His hand shot out and swiped the expensive crystal wine glass right off the table. It shattered against the marble floor, sending dark red Cabernet splashing across the baseboards like fresh blood. The jazz pianist in the main dining room abruptly stopped playing. The entire restaurant went dead silent, but Spencer did not care. He pushed his chair back so violently that it tipped over and hit the floor with a loud crack. He stood up, towering over the table with his face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. The polite, arrogant real estate broker was completely gone. The cornered animal had finally come out to fight, and he was backed entirely into a corner with absolutely nothing left to lose. He pointed a shaking, sweaty finger directly at my father, Winston. Spencer did not beg for forgiveness, and he did not try to explain away the massive financial crimes I had just laid out on the table. Instead, he chose to inflict as much pain as humanly possible. He laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed in the small alcove. He told my father to stop crying like a pathetic child. He said Winston deserved every single thing that was happening to him because he was an absolute fool. Spencer leaned over the table, the veins in his neck bulging as he told my parents they were the most gullible, desperate people he had ever met in his entire life. He said it was practically a public service to take their money because they were too incredibly stupid to manage it themselves. Spencer looked at my mother Brenda, who was staring up at him in absolute terror. He told her she was a shallow, empty woman who cared more about what the women at her country club thought than her own actual children. He said she made it incredibly easy for him to steal from them because she was so desperately eager to buy her way into high society. He sneered at her gold jewelry, calling it cheap and tacky. He said he never even had to try to con them because the moment he walked into their house 7 years ago, they practically handed him the keys to their bank accounts. He reminded Winston that he had willingly signed away the house he had lived in for 30 years simply because Spencer smiled at him and used a few corporate buzzwords. And then the mask slipped completely off, and the true, deep-seated racism that had always fueled his arrogance came pouring out in a vile, toxic wave. He looked back and forth between my parents and told them exactly why they had worshipped him. He said they were so desperate to have a white son-in-law to parade around their wealthy friends that they completely ignored every single red flag. He called them pathetic social climbers who were so desperate for white validation that they would sell their own souls just to sit at the country club table. He said they hated their own reflection so much that they practically begged him to take their money just so they could feel adjacent to his whiteness. And then he crossed the final unforgivable line. His face turned bright red with pure rage, and he hurled a string of vile racial slurs directly at my family. The horrific words hung in the cold air-conditioned air of the upscale restaurant, completely shattering any remaining illusion of civility. He called them ignorant and uneducated, using the most degrading, racially charged language imaginable. He said they were nothing but ghetto trash wearing expensive suits, trying to pretend they belonged in his world. Brianna let out a blood-curdling scream. She stood up and grabbed Spencer by the lapels of his navy blazer, shaking him wildly. She screamed at him to stop talking and demanded to know how he could say those horrific things to her family. Spencer did not even hesitate. He grabbed her wrists and violently shoved her backward, making her stumble and fall hard into the empty chair behind her. He looked down at his wife, the woman who had worshipped the ground. He walked on and told her she was just as stupid and worthless as her parents. He said he never loved her and that she was nothing but a convenient bank account with a pretty face. He told Brianna the only reason he stayed with her for so long was because her father was dumb enough to keep signing whatever paperwork he put in front of him. He said she was a terrible wife, a terrible person, and a massive financial burden that he was finally thrilled to drop. I watched my father Winston as the horrific reality of Spencer and his true nature finally washed over him. Winston looked like he was physically aging years by the second. His face sagged and his broad shoulders hunched forward as if an invisible crushing weight had been dropped directly onto his spine. This was the man he had chosen over me. This was the man he had chosen over Malik. Winston had actively participated in the emotional abuse of his own black daughter and her black husband just to protect this vicious, racist white man who was now standing in a public restaurant screaming slurs at him. The absolute devastation in my father and his eyes was profound. His entire worldview, his core belief system, his desperate need for white validation had just been completely destroyed by the very idol he had spent 7 years relentlessly worshipping. Brenda had slumped completely over in her chair, her face buried in her hands, rocking back and forth as the racial slurs echoed in her ears. Malik remained perfectly seated, his posture straight and his expression completely unbothered by the pathetic display of rage. He did not rise to the bait, and he did not let the racial slurs break his calm exterior. Malik simply watched Spencer with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist, observing a diseased insect. Spencer noticed Malik staring at him, and it seemed to infuriate him even more. He turned his aggressive focus toward my husband, screaming that Malik was still nothing but a broke public school teacher and that the foundation documents had to be fake. Spencer was completely losing his grip on reality, refusing to accept that he had been entirely outsmarted by the man he had spent the entire evening insulting. He pointed a shaking finger at Malik and told him he was going to call the police and have him arrested for fraud. It was the desperate, pathetic threat of a man who had absolutely no bullets left in his gun. Spencer slammed his fist down onto the white tablecloth, sending the expensive silver flatware clattering to the floor. He screamed that he was going to ruin all of us and that we were going to end up homeless on the streets where we belonged. But his threats were completely empty, and everyone in the room knew it. He was a broke, desperate criminal, throwing a massive temper tantrum because his elaborate trap had just snapped shut directly on his own leg. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the restaurant manager and two large security guards quickly approaching our private dining alcove, drawn by the sound of the shattering glass and the loud, violent shouting. Spencer was out of time, out of money, and completely out of options. He had finally exposed his true disgusting colors to the entire world, and there was absolutely no turning back for any of them. The two large security guards reached our table before Spencer could throw another piece of silver or break another crystal glass. They grabbed him firmly by both arms, pinning them tightly behind his back despite his wild, angry thrashing. The restaurant manager, a tall man with a severe expression, stood right in front of my father and demanded to know who was going to pay for the damages to the private alcove. Spencer was still screaming racial slurs and violent obscenities as the guards dragged him backward out of the private room and straight through the main dining area. Every single wealthy patron in the upscale restaurant stopped eating their expensive meals to watch the so-called brilliant real estate developer get hauled out the front door like a common criminal. Brianna was slumped heavily in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup completely ruined and running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. The silence that fell over our table after Spencer completely disappeared was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was the absolute deafening silence of total financial and social ruin. My mother Brenda was shaking so violently that her cheap gold bracelets rattled loudly against the white linen tablecloth. She looked at the doorway where Spencer had just been dragged out, and then she slowly turned her head to look directly at me. The sheer panic swimming in her eyes was almost hard to witness. The brutal reality of her situation was finally sinking deeply into her bones. She was going to lose her beautiful home. She was going to lose her fake status. She was going to be the absolute center of gossip for her entire church congregation. The wealthy social circle she had sacrificed my entire childhood to impress was going to chew her up and spit her out the very moment they found out she was completely broke. Winston was staring blankly at the shattered glass and the spilled dark wine on the floor, his broad chest heaving as he struggled to draw a full breath. He had eagerly traded his dignity and his family for a racist con artist, and the massive bill had just arrived at the table. Suddenly, Brenda lunged awkwardly across the table. Her hands desperately reached out and clamped down hard over my wrists. Her fingers were ice cold, and her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman who was actively hyperventilating. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, pleading with me to please help them fix this. She cried out that I was their daughter, their own precious flesh and blood. She started using the exact same manipulative phrases she had used to control me for my entire life, telling me that blood is thicker than water and that a real family must always stick together during the dark times. She begged me to take the spreadsheets and the foreclosure documents and just make them disappear somehow. She told me I was so incredibly smart and that I worked with complex money all day long so I could easily find a legal loophole to save their house from the bank. She promised with tears streaming down her face that things would be different now, and that she would finally give me the love and respect I deserved if I just saved them from this terrible nightmare. I looked down at her hands gripping my wrists so tightly. For 22 years, I would have done absolutely anything in the world to hear my mother say she respected me. I would have moved mountains just to get her to look at me with genuine pride instead of constant disappointment. But sitting here tonight watching her beg me to clean up the catastrophic mess she made by worshiping a white man who openly hated her, I felt absolutely nothing at all. The little girl inside me who used to cry alone in her bedroom, wondering why she was never good enough, was completely gone forever. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands backward, breaking her desperate physical grip. I slid my arms off the table and folded them quietly in my lap, looking at her with a cold, detached stare. I told her that blood is only thicker than water when it is not actively being used to drown you. Winston saw me pull away and realized my mother was failing to manipulate me. His panic spiked even higher, and he immediately turned his desperate attention toward Malik, the very same man he had viciously mocked just 30 minutes ago. The same man he had insultingly offered a manual landscaping job to was now his absolute last hope on earth. Winston swallowed his massive pride, the toxic pride that had driven our family straight into the ground, and looked at my husband with pathetic, pleading eyes. He asked Malik about the Educational Heritage Foundation. He stammered over his words, his voice thick and desperate, asking if Malik could please use his $50 million endowment to quietly buy their primary residence from the bank before it went into official foreclosure. Winston practically begged Malik to let them stay in their house, promising they would pay rent to the foundation for the rest of their natural lives. He told Malik he knew he was a good Christian man, a righteous man who would never let his own in-laws end up sleeping on the street. Malik did not gloat. He did not laugh in my father and his face the way Spencer would have done if the roles were reversed. Malik simply maintained his quiet, dignified composure, which somehow made his rejection sting even worse for my father. He looked at Winston with mild pity and explained that the foundation was a strictly regulated nonprofit organization governed by a very strict board of directors. He told my father that he could not and would not embezzle federal foundation funds to bail out a private citizen who willingly signed a fraudulent mortgage document. Malik said his life mission was to protect the history of our people, not to act as a personal emergency piggy bank for a man who had spent the last 7 years treating him like absolute dirt. Malik told Winston very clearly and calmly that his request was not only highly illegal but deeply insulting. Brenda let out a loud, wailing sob, putting her face down on the table right next to the spilled wine. She cried out that we were maliciously punishing them for making a simple mistake, and that God would surely judge us for turning our backs on our own parents in their greatest time of need. Brianna finally lifted her head from her hands, looking at me with a twisted, ugly expression of hatred and despair. She accused me of planning this entire dinner just to humiliate them in public. She said I wanted them to lose everything so I could finally feel superior to the golden child. I looked directly at my sister and told her I did not plan Spencer and his fake shell company, and I certainly did not force Winston to blindly sign away the deed to his own house. I told them they built this entire elaborate trap themselves and eagerly walked right into it, simply because it was presented to them by someone who looked like Spencer. The absolute desperation hanging in the air was thick and foul. They had tried angry threats. They had tried emotional guilt trips. And now they were trying outright humiliating begging, but none of it was working to move us. The fortress I had slowly built around my life with Malik was completely impenetrable to their toxicity. My parents were sitting there helplessly watching the walls of their entire life collapse inward, finally realizing that the daughter they threw away was the only person with a life raft. They begged me one last time to just give them the $10,000 so they could at least hire a decent bankruptcy lawyer. Winston said he knew Spencer did not actually have the money, but maybe I could spare it from my own wealthy salary to help my family survive the coming storm. They genuinely thought that this humiliating begging session was the absolute bottom of the barrel. They thought the worst part of the night was finally over and that the full extent of the damage was out in the open. They looked at me with pathetic, watery eyes, waiting for me to show a tiny ounce of mercy. They had absolutely no idea that I was saving the most devastating piece of information for last. I watched my parents sobbing and begging for a few more seconds before I finally decided it was time to end this miserable charade once and for all. I slowly pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the marble floor. I stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in my charcoal dress. The restaurant manager was still standing near our table, furiously writing notes on his clipboard, while the two massive security guards were just about to drag Spencer through the main dining room doors. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the heavy sounds of my mother crying. I looked at the manager and told him to please hold that man for just one more minute. The manager hesitated, but there was something in my tone that made him nod to the guards. The two large men stopped right at the threshold of our private alcove, keeping Spencer firmly pinned by his arms. I walked slowly around the ruined table, stepping carefully over the shattered crystal and the dark red wine soaking into the expensive carpet. My parents stopped crying and looked up at me with puffy, confused eyes. Brianna sniffled, wiping her ruined makeup, watching me approach her husband. Spencer was breathing heavily like a wild animal caught in a snare. His expensive navy blazer was torn at the shoulder, and his perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess sticking to his sweaty forehead. He glared at me with pure venom, but underneath that anger I could see the absolute terror of a man who knew he had just lost everything. I stopped just 2 feet away from him. I did not cross my arms or try to make myself look physically intimidating. I simply looked at him with the calm, clinical detachment of an executioner who was about to drop the final blade. I asked him a very simple question. I asked him if he had recently submitted a commercial loan application to Vanguard Investment Group. The transformation in his face was immediate and absolute. The hateful sneer vanished completely. All the blood rushed out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened slightly, but he could not force a single word out. His eyes darted frantically, searching my face, trying to understand how I could possibly know the name of the exact financial institution he was trying to defraud. My father, Winston, let out a confused, raspy breath from the table, asking what Vanguard had to do with any of this. I did not look back at my father. I kept my eyes locked directly on Spencer and watched his entire reality begin to completely unravel right in front of me. I spoke slowly, making sure every single syllable landed with the maximum amount of destructive force. I told Spencer that Vanguard Investment Group is one of the most prestigious and heavily regulated financial institutions in the entire country. I explained that when a desperate developer tries to secure a $20 million commercial loan using a fraudulent shell company and a piece of historical heritage land, the application does not just get approved by an automated computer system. I told him that high-risk files are immediately flagged and sent directly to the top floor for a manual forensic review. Spencer swallowed so hard I could hear the click in his throat from 2 feet away. His knees actually buckled slightly, but the security guards held him up tightly. I leaned in just a fraction closer. I told him that my parents had spent the last 7 years telling everyone in our extended family that I was just a lowly number cruncher. They had completely minimized my career because they were so desperate to inflate his fake success. I told Spencer he should have done his own background check on the family he was trying to steal from instead of blindly trusting their ignorant gossip. I let the silence hang in the cold air for a few agonizing seconds before I finally delivered the ultimate crushing blow. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes and told him I am the Senior Director of Risk Audit at Vanguard Investment Group. A loud collective gasp erupted from the dining table behind me. My mother, Brenda, dropped her hands from her face, staring at my back in absolute stunned disbelief. Brianna let out a small, pathetic whimper, covering her mouth with both hands. Spencer stopped struggling against the security guards completely. His body went totally limp. His brain was entirely short-circuiting, trying to process the impossible magnitude of what I had just said. The person he had spent all night insulting, the woman he thought he could easily manipulate into handing over millions of dollars, was the exact same person who controlled the keys to the massive corporate vault he was actively trying to rob. I did not stop there. I wanted him to feel every single ounce of the despair he had tried to force onto my family. I told him that his file landed on my massive mahogany desk exactly 3 days ago. I explained how I sat in my corner office looking over the pathetic forged signatures, the inflated asset reports, and the ridiculous fake business plans for his luxury condos. I told him I saw exactly what he was trying to do to my grandfather and his legacy. I described the physical feeling of holding the heavy rubber stamp in my right hand. I told him that at 8 o'clock this morning, before I even drank my first cup of coffee, I personally pressed that stamp down onto the front page of his application in bright red ink. I told him I stamped it, rejected. I made sure he understood that his precious lifeline was completely dead before he even put on his expensive suit to come to this dinner tonight. I explained that this entire evening, the expensive wine, the condescending speeches, the threats to disinherit me, none of it ever mattered. I had already completely destroyed his escape route hours before we even sat down at the table. I told him I just wanted him to sit here and expose his true racist, disgusting nature to my family so they could finally see the monster they had chosen over their own daughter. Spencer stared at me, his eyes wide and completely vacant. He had nothing left. His fake wealth was gone. His marriage was destroyed. His secret debts were exposed, and his one single chance at a massive corporate bailout had been personally crushed by the black woman he had just called a racial slur. The sheer poetic justice of the moment was so absolute and so heavy that he could not even formulate a response. He just hung his head, staring blankly down at his expensive leather loafers. I turned to the restaurant manager, who was watching the entire exchange with wide, shocked eyes. I gave him a polite nod and told him he could go ahead and take the trash out now. The security guards did not hesitate. They yanked Spencer backward, roughly dragging his limp, defeated body out through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and throwing him out into the humid Atlanta night. As the security guards dragged Spencer through the main dining room, the sheer public humiliation finally snapped him out of his paralyzed daze. He realized he was being thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing to his name. The polite clapping and quiet whispers of the wealthy patrons watching him get hauled away acted like a bucket of ice water to his face. He suddenly planted his expensive leather loafers firmly onto the polished marble floor and violently jerked his shoulders, twisting his entire body with the desperate, frantic energy of a trapped rat. He managed to break his arms free from the grip of the two massive guards for just a split second. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy glass doors of the front entrance. He was going to make a run for it. He was going to bolt out into the humid Atlanta night and try to hide from the massive collapse of his fake empire. But before he could even take 3 steps toward freedom, the restaurant manager stepped directly into his path, completely blocking the exit. The manager was a tall, broad-shouldered man who did not look amused in the slightest by this pathetic display. He held up a sleek black leather folder containing the final bill for the evening. The manager loudly announced to the entire silent lobby that Spencer could not leave the premises until he settled the open tab for the massive amount of food and alcohol he had demanded. He read the total out loud, making absolutely sure everyone in the room heard that the vintage Cabernet and the private dining room fees added up to over $4,000. Spencer patted the pockets of his torn navy blazer, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He pulled out a heavy gold metal credit card and shoved it into the manager, and his hands screaming at him to just run the card quickly and let him leave. I walked slowly out of the private alcove with Malik right beside me, stopping in the lobby to watch the pathetic scene unfold. My parents and my sister stumbled out of the hallway right behind us, looking like absolute ghosts. The manager swiped the heavy gold card through the terminal at the host stand. The machine let out a loud, sharp, angry beep. Declined. Spencer frantically dug into his pockets and pulled out another card, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He tossed it onto the polished wood counter, demanding the manager try again. swiped and declined again. He tried 3 different credit cards, pulling them out of his expensive leather wallet with pure frantic desperation. Every single one of them was immediately rejected. The whispers and the low, mocking laughter from the wealthy patrons in the lobby began to echo loudly around the elegant room. Spencer was completely humiliated, unable to even pay for the wine he had used to try and intimidate my husband earlier that night. I stepped right up to the host stand, standing just a few feet away from his trembling, pathetic form. I looked at the manager and calmly told him the credit card machine was not broken. I turned to Spencer and spoke loud enough for the entire lobby and my horrified parents to hear every single word. I told Spencer he should not be worrying about a $4,000 restaurant bill right now. I told him he had much bigger and much darker problems heading his way. I watched his eyes widen in pure panic as I leaned in close, holding his gaze with absolute cold authority. I explained that when I rejected his massive commercial loan application at Vanguard this morning, I did not just throw his paperwork into a shredder and move on with my day. I told him that as a senior director of risk audit, I have a strict legal and fiduciary duty to report all instances of severe financial fraud directly to the proper authorities. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for a brief moment before dropping the final devastating bomb. I told him I took the entire thick file containing all of his fake corporate documents, the forged signatures of my gullible father, and the completely falsified asset reports, and I forwarded every single page directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a walking corpse. I explained that I personally spoke to a federal agent on the phone right after my lunch break today. I told Spencer the FBI was not going to send him a polite letter in the mail asking for a routine audit. They were actively building a major criminal case against him for federal wire fraud right this very second. I made sure he understood the brutal reality of his situation. He was not just going bankrupt. He was not just getting a bad credit score. He was facing decades inside a federal penitentiary for attempting to defraud a major corporate bank and forging official financial documents across state lines. The complete reality of federal prison finally hit him with the force of a speeding train. His legs gave out completely. He collapsed heavily against the wooden host stand, his hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He looked at me with eyes full of absolute raw terror, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He tried to speak, he tried to formulate some sort of desperate apology or pathetic excuse, but his throat was completely closed up. He was absolutely broken, entirely destroyed by his own arrogant greed. The restaurant manager, seeing the massive disaster unfolding in his elegant lobby, picked up the telephone on his desk and loudly stated he was calling the local Atlanta police to report the unpaid bill and the deliberate destruction of private property in the dining alcove. Spencer tried to push himself off the counter to run, but his legs were entirely useless. The 2 large security guards immediately stepped up and grabbed him by the shoulders again, this time forcing him down onto a velvet waiting bench near the entrance. They told him he was absolutely not going anywhere until the police arrived to sort out the theft of the expensive wine. He was completely trapped with nowhere left to run. My parents, Winston and Brenda, stood frozen near the hallway, watching their beloved white son-in-law hyperventilating on a velvet bench while waiting for the police to come arrest him. Brianna was sobbing loudly, leaning against the wall, unable to even look at the man she had married. I looked at the manager and pulled a sleek black corporate card out of my designer bag. I told the manager I would gladly pay for the damages to the private alcove and the meals my husband and I had consumed, but I would absolutely not be paying a single dime for the vintage Cabernet or the rest of the massive bill Spencer had racked up. The manager nodded respectfully and quickly ran my card, handing me the receipt. I signed it with a smooth, steady hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace wash over my entire body. I put my card away and slipped my arm gracefully through Malik and his waiting arm. We did not say another word to Spencer, who was currently rocking back and forth on the velvet bench, muttering incoherently to himself about fake investors and bankruptcy lawyers. We did not say another word to my parents, who were staring at me with expressions of pure, devastating regret. Malik pushed open the heavy glass doors, and we walked out into the warm, humid night air, leaving the absolute wreckage of my toxic family and their golden boy entirely behind us. Just before we completely pushed open the heavy glass doors to step out into the night, I stopped in my tracks. Malik paused right beside me, his hand resting gently on the small of my back. He did not rush me, and he did not ask any questions, because he knew there was one final thing I needed to do to completely sever the invisible chains that had held me for 32 years. I turned around and walked slowly back across the polished marble floor of the lobby, leaving the entrance behind and heading straight back toward the private dining alcove. The restaurant was still buzzing with low whispers from the wealthy patrons, who were all still watching the aftermath of the absolute chaos my family had created. When I reached the entrance of the alcove, the scene was absolutely pathetic. The three of them were sitting around the ruined table, looking like the terrified survivors of a massive shipwreck. The spilled vintage Cabernet had completely soaked into the expensive white linen tablecloth, looking exactly like a dark red wound. Shattered crystal was scattered everywhere, reflecting the warm, ambient light of the chandelier above, without Spencer there to act as the wealthy golden anchor. The fragile alliance between my parents and my sister was rapidly and completely deteriorating. Brianna was standing up, gripping the edge of the table, her mascara running down her face in thick black rivers. She was screaming hysterically at my father, blaming him for letting Spencer take out the secret second mortgage on their house. She told Winston he was a weak, stupid old man who should have protected the family money instead of blindly signing every single piece of paper her husband put in front of him. Winston shot up out of his heavy wooden chair, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger right back at his favorite daughter, the beautiful golden child he had sacrificed my entire college fund for. He yelled that Brianna was a spoiled, ungrateful brat who drove Spencer into massive debt with her ridiculous shopping sprees and her desperate need to impress her fake country club friends. My mother, Brenda, was caught right in the middle, sobbing loudly and begging them to stop shouting because people were staring at them. She tried to grab Brianna by the hand, but Brianna violently slapped her mother away, telling Brenda that she was the one who practically worshipped Spencer and enabled his behavior simply because he was a wealthy white man. They were viciously tearing each other apart, right there in the middle of the expensive restaurant. It was a brutal, ugly display of what toxic people do when their chosen scapegoat is no longer available to absorb their poison. They had spent my entire life blaming me for everything that went wrong, but now that I was completely untouchable and Spencer was on his way to jail, they had absolutely no choice but to turn their venom directly on each other. I walked right up to the edge of the table. The sheer force of my silent presence made all three of them snap their mouths shut immediately. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, probably hoping I had come back to offer them some kind of last-minute financial miracle. I reached down and picked up the crisp $10,000 check that Attorney Caldwell had so arrogantly offered me earlier that day. It had been sitting near my untouched dinner plate the entire evening, ignored during the massive confrontation. I held the piece of paper up between two fingers, letting them look at the pathetic bribe they thought would buy my silence and my grandfather and his legacy. I looked at my father, who was trembling with a mixture of raw rage and sheer panic. I looked at my mother, who was clutching her chest like she was having a heart attack. And finally, I looked at Brianna, who was staring at the check with absolute desperate hunger in her eyes. I did not yell, and I did not raise my voice. I simply let the check slip from my fingers. It fluttered slowly through the air, landing right in the middle of a dark red puddle of spilled wine. I told them they were going to need every single penny they could find, because the federal government does not offer public defenders for massive commercial wire fraud. I told them to take that wet piece of paper and use it to hire the best criminal defense attorney they could find. Because when the FBI starts freezing their bank accounts tomorrow morning, they are going to have absolutely nothing left. Nobody said a word. They just stared blindly down at the ruined check slowly soaking up the spilled wine. I turned my back on them for the very last time. Malik was standing right at the edge of the alcove waiting for me with a warm, incredibly proud smile on his face. I walked over to him and seamlessly linked my arm through his, holding him tightly against my side. We walked together through the upscale restaurant, our heads held high, our steps perfectly in sync. We did not look back, not even once. The moment we finally pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night, a massive, suffocating weight completely lifted off my chest. The air felt incredibly light and fresh in my lungs. The valet quickly brought my car around, and Malik opened the door for me, making sure I was safely inside before walking around to the passenger seat. As I started the engine and pulled out onto the busy city streets, the bright lights of the Atlanta skyline seemed to sparkle just a little bit brighter. Malik reached across the center console and gently took my hand, intertwining his strong, warm fingers with mine. He looked at me in the soft glow of the dashboard lights and told me he had never been more proud of me in his entire life. I leaned my head back against the smooth leather seat, letting out a long, shaky exhale that contained 32 years of pain rejection and profound unworthiness. I had finally done it. I had stood up to the people who broke me, and I had completely dismantled the toxic empire they built on my back. I was driving away from my dark past and straight into a beautiful, peaceful future that I had built with my own two hands alongside a man who truly loved me. The desperate people-pleasing scapegoat was officially dead, and in her place was a powerful woman who would never let anyone make her feel small ever again. Exactly. 1 month passed since the night I walked out of that restaurant, and the absolute destruction of my family happened faster than even I had anticipated. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not drag its feet when it comes to massive commercial wire fraud. Early on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner, two black unmarked SUV vehicles pulled up onto the manicured driveway of Spencer and his luxury townhouse. Federal agents kicked in his front door while he was still sleeping and dragged him out onto the street in heavy metal handcuffs. The local news stations had an absolute field day broadcasting the footage of the arrogant real estate developer being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle wearing nothing but sweatpants and a look of pure, unadulterated terror. His fake investment fund was completely seized by the government. His personal bank accounts were entirely frozen, and he was denied bail because the federal judge deemed him a massive flight risk. Spencer is currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, waiting for a trial that will inevitably end with him spending the next 2 decades of his life behind bars. Brianna filed for divorce the very same afternoon. He was arrested, desperately trying to distance herself from the criminal fallout and the public embarrassment. But she quickly learned that the legal system does not care about her bruised ego or her tears. Because they were legally married, and she had actively enjoyed the lavish lifestyle funded by his fraudulent loans, a massive portion of the debt fell directly onto her shoulders. Her shiny luxury SUV was repossessed right out of a grocery store parking lot while she was inside buying expensive wine. Her personal bank accounts were garnished by aggressive creditors, and she was forced to sell every single designer handbag and piece of expensive jewelry she owned just to afford a cheap, desperate divorce lawyer. She went from looking down her nose at my husband to working double shifts at a low-end retail store just to survive. She is currently drowning in millions of dollars of shared debt and living in a tiny studio apartment miles away from the precious country club she used to brag about. But the most devastating karma fell exactly where it was deserved the most. The dangerous hard money lenders that Spencer owed did not hesitate for a single second when his monthly payments completely stopped. They immediately executed the hidden second mortgage he had tricked my father into signing. Winston and Brenda received a formal eviction notice taped right to the heavy wooden front door of the 4-bedroom colonial house they had proudly lived in for over 30 years. The bank gave them exactly 14 days to vacate the premises completely. The wealthy church friends and the country club socialites my mother had spent my entire childhood trying to impress completely vanished the very moment the foreclosure became public knowledge. Nobody offered them a spare bedroom, and absolutely nobody offered to loan them a single dime to save their home. My parents were forced to pack their entire lives into cheap cardboard boxes and black garbage bags. They had to move into a run-down one-bedroom apartment in a terrible neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, far away from the elite circles they had sacrificed my childhood to belong to. For the first 2 weeks after they moved, my phone was constantly flooded with frantic sobbing voicemails from both of them. Winston would leave long, rambling messages crying heavily into the phone, begging me to find it in my heart to forgive an old foolish man. He pleaded with me to ask Malik for a small personal loan, just to help them buy basic groceries and pay their new incredibly high rent. Brenda would leave incredibly desperate voice notes wailing about how cold their new apartment was and how they had absolutely nothing left to their names. She tried to use the blood is thicker than water line one last time, hoping the sound of her genuine suffering would finally break my boundaries. But listening to their tears did not bring me joy, and it did not bring me sadness. It just brought me absolute profound indifference. I listened to their final voicemails, deleted them permanently from my inbox, and completely blocked all of their phone numbers. I contacted my service provider the very next morning and changed my personal cell phone number entirely, erasing their final avenue of access to my life. It has now been 6 months since that terrible dinner, and my life has never been more beautiful or more peaceful. It is a bright, sunny Saturday morning, and I'm standing right in the heart of the sweet Auburn district, holding a pair of giant golden ceremonial scissors. Malik is standing right next to me wearing a sharp gray suit, holding my hand tightly, his eyes shining with immense pride. The piece of land that my grandfather Theodore left behind is completely safe. There are no ugly glass towers, and there are no luxury coffee shops trying to erase the rich history of our people. Instead, sitting right on the lush green grass is a beautifully restored historical building featuring wide, welcoming doors and huge windows that let the natural sunlight pour into the rooms. Today is the official grand opening of the Theodore Heritage Educational Center, funded entirely by Malik and his massive preservation foundation. Hundreds of people from the local community have gathered around us, smiling and cheering loudly. Local city council members and community leaders are giving powerful speeches about the importance of protecting our history and investing in the future of our youth. I look up at the heavy bronze plaque mounted right next to the front entrance of the beautiful brick building. It does not feature the name of a fraudulent white developer trying to gentrify our neighborhood. It proudly bears the name of my grandfather, honoring his decades of hard work and his unwavering belief in the power of education and community strength. As Malik and I cut the thick red ribbon together, the crowd erupts into loud, joyful applause. I look out at the sea of smiling faces, and I realize something deeply profound about the true nature of family. The people who clapped for me today, the people who supported Malik and his vision, the friends who stood by us when things were difficult, they are my real family. Family is absolutely not determined by sharing a biological bloodline with people who treat you like a constant burden. It is not about sacrificing your own mental health and your own financial stability to protect the fragile egos of people who would gladly throw you to the wolves just to save face. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor full of love and mutual support, not a constant toxic battlefield where you have to beg on your hands and knees for a tiny scrap of basic human respect. For 32 years, I let my biological parents and my jealous sister convince me that I was broken simply because I refused to blindly conform to their toxic, superficial standards. I let them drain my resources, my emotional energy, and my self-worth because I mistakenly believed that family loyalty meant enduring their abuse in absolute silence. But walking away from them in that restaurant was the most empowering decision I have ever made in my entire existence. The ultimate lesson I had to learn, the absolute hard way, is that you must never set yourself on fire simply to keep those who hate you warm. You cannot save people who are actively committed to their own financial and moral destruction. And you owe absolutely nothing to those who only value you for what they can aggressively extract from your life. I have built a beautiful, rich, and completely authentic life entirely free from the heavy chains of their constant suffocating judgment. My career as a senior director is thriving. My marriage is built on an unbreakable foundation of absolute mutual respect, and my heart is finally completely at peace. I no longer look back at the dark past with anger or regret. I only look forward because the bright, spectacular future I am building is entirely my own. If you have ever felt like the black sheep or the designated scapegoat in your own toxic family, I want you to know that your worth is not defined by their tragic inability to love you properly. You have the absolute right to stand up from tables where respect is no longer being served, and you have the right to walk away without feeling an ounce of guilt. Have you ever had to permanently cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own mental peace and financial security? How did you finally find the courage to walk away and completely rebuild your life from the ground up? Please let me know your powerful stories in the comments section down below. I read every single one of them, and I absolutely love connecting with people who have survived similar painful journeys. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content about healing, setting ironclad boundaries, and reclaiming your personal power. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your greatest revenge will always be your own spectacular, unbothered success.